So with that, I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon, all. My name is Fred Jones. I'm the policy director at the Aurora Institute. I'm happy that you guys were able to join us this afternoon for our webinar. If we go to the next slide, please. This webinar itself is a joint webinar with some key partners here at ECS and KnowledgeWorks. Today we have a number of different speakers, including Ben Irwin, policy analyst over at the Education Commission of the States, and John Alfith at KnowledgeWorks, who is co-hosting this webinar with us to talk about the student-centered learning policy advancements that's taken place over the course of 2021. Next slide, please. We also have with us two key partners in states in Utah and also in Washington State. We have Ms. Angie Stallings, the Deputy Superintendent of Policy at the Utah State Board of Education, and along with Alyssa Muller, Director of the Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative at the Washington State Board of Education. And again, my name is Fred Jones. I'm the Policy Director here at the Aurora Institute. And again, we are putting on this webinar in partnership with KnowledgeWorks and the Education Commission of the States. And we'll have a little bit of a longer introduction throughout the presentation as well. If you go to the next slide, please. Just a brief overview and a run of show today. We're going to go through brief introductions and definition of key terms. We're going to have an overview of state policy trends, a moderated state discussion, state presentations, and then we're going to close with state recommendations and Q&A from the audience. Next slide. Just to get us started, and before we get into the bulk of the agenda, I wanted to make sure that we had a baseline understanding of key terminology. The Aurora Institute itself, we've been working to advance student-centered learning policies over nearly 20 years. And we have a four-part definition, or we use a four-part definition of student-centered learning to guide our policy, our research, and our field building work. We consider the definition of student-centered learning that we work off of is a four-part definition, and student-centered learning means where learning is personalized, learning is competency-based, learning happens anytime, anywhere, and students take ownership over their learning and have agency. And additionally, how we define personalized learning is that personalized learning is tailored for each student's strengths, needs, and interests, so that in the classroom or throughout the school, the curriculum is designed for each individual student so that they can have voice and choice in what they learn. Next slide, please. And additionally, a key terminology so that there's also a baseline understanding, because this is how we went about selecting the legislative information that we want to share with you, is our definition of competency-based education. A couple years ago, the Aurora Institute published an updated 7-part definition of competency-based education. This definition was essentially derived with hundreds and hundreds of people, which included policymakers, parents, practitioners, researchers, educators, to help define what competency-based education is in real time and practice today. And in this 7-part definition, it includes essentially that students are empowered to make daily and important decisions about their learning experiences in the classroom each and every day, where assessments are meaningful, positive, and empowering for students, where students are receiving timely, differentiated support based off of individual learning needs, that students progress based off of evidence of mastery and not antiquated seat time policies. Additionally, where students are able to utilize different pathways. It also includes a focus on equity, where all students are embedded in the culture, structure, and pedagogy of the school and the education system at large. And lastly, this updated definition includes rigorous common expectations and also common outcomes for all students. And it's important that we just wanted to go over these definitions because we use this as well, one, these three terms overlap with one another, but also it was the basis of the legislative efforts and regulatory efforts that we decided to share with you all today. So with that, I am actually going to transition over to my colleague Ben from ECS to provide an overview of student-centered learning activities over the course of this past year. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Fred. Hello, everyone. 2021 was a really active year for student-centered learning in the States. And today I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the trends that we've seen at ECS from across the country. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, one more slide for me. But first, as you just heard, my name is Ben Irwin, and I'm a policy analyst with Education Commission of the States. I cover a variety of topics across the P20 spectrum, but I track state policy and competency-based education, public and private school choice, virtual schools, and other forms of innovation in education. Next slide, please. Education Commission of the States is a nonpartisan organization that provides support to state policymakers on education issues across the P20 spectrum. We track legislative trends, report on the latest research and state policy movement, provide counsel directly to policymakers, and convene experts and education leaders alike from across the country. Next slide, please. Now that I've given you a rundown of who we are and what we do, let's dive into some of the trends that we've seen in student-centered learning over the course of the last year. State policymakers have primarily driven SCL forward in three key ways: task forces and study groups, instructional flexibility at the local level, and governance changes. Next slide, please. As you can see, quite a few states have developed task forces and study committees to consider more student-centered practices. In Arizona, House Bill 2135 directed the State Board of Education to study competency-based pathways for demonstrating college and career readiness before developing rules that would then govern those pathways. After the study, the State Board must develop subject area competencies beginning with mathematics coursework and create a mechanism for allowing pupils to immediately earn credit through the demonstration of mastery. And they need to develop these rules and regulations by the end of 2022. Similarly, North Dakota and Texas enacted legislation establishing study groups to explore innovative education programs. In Texas, the study group will focus on competency-based education in particular, and they're going to be looking at how to fund CBE programs, how to evaluate CBE programs in the state accountability system, and ways of providing CBE offerings to specific student groups, including adult students. North Dakota, on the other hand, is going to look back at a policy that's already in place that allows states to receive waivers from state statute, or schools to receive waivers from state statute to establish more innovative education programs, which could include competency-based education. Finally, Oregon and Kansas have established graduation requirements task forces, with Oregon adopting an equity lens to examine their current grad requirements, and Kansas exploring new options with an emphasis on identifying multiple ways for students to show mastery and allowing students to progress at their own pace. The Kansas Task Force in particular was established by the commissioner to develop recommendations for the state board by spring of 2022. The task force includes multiple subcommittees with representation from the state board and legislature, as well as district and school personnel, including leaders, educators, and counselors. In Oregon, Senate Bill 744 directed the Department of Education to do a comprehensive review of high school diploma requirements with a focus on equity, accessibility, and inclusivity. Specifically, Oregon is going to discuss the alignment of current grad requirements with expectations of employers and post-secondary institutions, and attempt to identify root causes for the current disparities in graduation rates, among a variety of other issues. And fortunately, we have somebody from Washington here today who's going to provide a lot more insight on the really exciting work going on in their state. Next slide, please. In addition to studying student-centered learning, some states moved to create flexibilities for districts and schools to implement these approaches on their own. Going back to Arizona, they also established a process for schools and districts to receive approval for the use of alternative instructional time models that would enable various forms of student-centered learning, including blended learning or competency-based education models. Under Arizona's new law, a school board must host at least 2 public hearings outlining those instructional models for the community, and establish attendance policies that are aligned with the model of their choosing. Under this policy, schools are able to reallocate instructional time on a per student basis to allow for differentiated pacing through coursework. Additionally, Montana moved to allow course and graduation requirements to be met through the demonstrations of proficiency. One bill in particular directed the superintendent of public instruction to develop a process for students earning a proficiency-based diploma, while another bill granted school boards the authority to waive course requirements, grant credit for proficiency demonstrations, and allow for credit to be awarded on a differentiated timeline as well. Nevada took a more targeted approach. The Nevada legislature took a more targeted approach to allow approved district distance education programs to provide asynchronous instruction, allow differentiated course spacing, and then finally award credit through mastery as well. North Dakota, who's been working with our friends at KnowledgeWorks, also carved out substantial flexibility for districts through House Bill 2196. The legislation directed the state board to establish a learning continuum that would give districts the authority to waive instructional time requirements in favor of a mastery framework policy for awarding credit. The state education agency has already developed a draft continuum for core courses in grades K through 12, in addition to a continuum for their profile of a graduate. The department is working with KnowledgeWorks to solicit public comment that will inform further work on finalizing that continuum. And again, thankfully, we have someone from Utah here with us today who can provide more info on exciting work in their state as well, and definitely looking forward to that conversation. So I have one more slide on state policy trends that we can switch over to now. Finally, the last at least two state legislatures moved forward with legislation to allow for alternative school governance models that could open the door and enable unique instructional models, including competency-based education. Both New Hampshire and South Carolina enacted legislation that would allow for innovation schools. Under these policies, schools may apply to receive waivers from state laws to enable more autonomy and flexibility in school management without being classified as a charter school. A number of states have innovation schools in operation, including Colorado, where ECS is based. And it's often viewed as a school improvement strategy because it does create that managerial flexibility. While findings on innovation schools are mixed and oftentimes depend on the model employed, the legislation really opens the door for schools to implement these innovative models. Next slide, please. For additional information on ECS's work in this space, I encourage you to check out these resources on our website. We developed a primer on policy or on competency-based education that identifies certain policy levers that can open the door for local implementation, including innovation schools, graduate profiles, and proficiency-based graduation requirements. Our friends at KnowledgeWorks guest authored a policy brief on the ways in which competency-based learning could support students throughout the pandemic and also be used as a strategy for educational recovery. And we've published multiple information requests on questions that we've received from our constituents on competency-based education, including this one that highlights some research on the student outcomes in CV programs. And then for the most up-to-date information on state legislative activity, please consult our policy tracking tool. We track all enacted legislation, and if you reach out to me, I could also highlight some proposed bills for you as well. Next slide, please. You can reach me at birwin@ecs.org or submit a request assistance form, and we'd love to continue to support your work in this space. And I really appreciate your all's time today, but without further ado, I will pass it to John to begin the state policy discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. It was great to hear about all the legislative trends that have been taking place over the past year across the country. Well, hello, my name is John Elfuth, and I am the Director of State Policy here at KnowledgeWorks, and I will be the moderator of our state-focused panel today. Before I jump into our state presenters, just a very brief overview of KnowledgeWorks. We are a national foundation based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and have been working to help create the future of learning for the past 20 years. We're committed to a systems-based approach to advancing the future of learning so that every learner has access to the tools, supports, and experiences that they need to graduate ready for what's next. And we work with local school districts and state-level policymakers, as well as at the federal level, to advance policies that support personalized, competence-based education. Now, before I jump in and introduce our panelists, I just want to, on the front end, just really encourage folks to drop questions in the chat as we go. We're going to hear a couple of short presentations followed by some back and forth discussion, and we will have a Q&A portion at the end, and we will make every attempt to get to any and all questions that are posed once we get to that point. Next slide, please. So next we are going to hear from two folks. First, we are going to be hearing from Deputy Superintendent Angie Stallings from Utah. In her role as Deputy Superintendent, Angie is responsible for policy review, rule writing, and legislative relations. Prior to her work at the State Board, Deputy Superintendent Stallings worked on public K-12 education and higher education issues as an attorney in the Utah Office of Legislative Research and as General Counsel. Next slide, please. All right, so with that, I will introduce our second presenter, Alyssa Muller from Washington, after we hear from Angie. So Angie, I think what we're gonna do next is you're gonna take us through some of the work that Utah has been doing in the recent past towards building a more student-centered system, as well as reflecting on some of the recent changes that have taken place over the last year, correct?
I am. Thank you, John. I'll just go ahead and start then. Good afternoon, everyone. Angie Stallings, as I was just introduced. I am honored to be here to represent the great work of so many amazing leaders, not only at USBE, but in our school districts and charter schools, and our wonderful partner policymakers at the Utah State Legislature, and of course our board members. You've got the slide before you that shows a bit of our journey in student-centered learning. So I'll just give a quick summary of all those and maybe go into depth a little more about one of the items that Ben mentioned, which is our work on learner-validated enrollment measurements and our work to take away seat time or have seat time be a driver. So first, you can see that in 2015 and 2016, the legislature passed an SB 143, which created competency-based education program, which provided grants to school districts and charter schools who were interested in really moving their individual districts and charter schools to a more competency-based or personalized competency-based learning. And the power of that bill or those grants is not only did it give funding to our LEAs, but it provided a focus and funding at the state board level so that our staff could help convene those leaders, those grant recipients to be able to come. We had partners such as KnowledgeWorks who came to support our grant recipients in providing them some professional learning support and research. Those groups, we awarded our first grants in 2017, and then we published our competency-based education framework in 2018. One of the big drivers of what we're doing now in student-centered learning was the creation of the Portrait of a Graduate. It is based in providing a map, which MAP is short for Mastery, Autonomy, and Purpose, for students to be able to obtain 13 characteristics that will help them to be able to succeed and lead once they exit our system upon graduation. That Portrait of a Graduate has really helped provide direction not only to the State Board of Education, but many of our school districts and charter schools have also created their own versions of the Portrait of a Graduate at their LEA level. We went through a very robust feedback. We received a bunch of feedback from so many different stakeholders, including, of course, legislators, policymakers, districts and charter schools, but we also engaged with business leaders and our higher ed partners to find out what it is they were hoping our students would be able to obtain and achieve before they left the K-12 system. After the Portrait of a Graduate in 2020, we created the P20 competencies for our personalized competency-based learning, and a lot of that was based on the Portrait of the Graduate, and then created some model rubrics earlier this year that help show how students are performing on each of those competencies, different levels of distinguishing where a student's at in each of those competencies. Also in 2020, the State Board of Education made big revisions to our board rule related to our minimum days and hours for schools to operate. So if you could go to the next slide. Part of what we did in 2020, this was prior or pre-COVID, the final version of the rule actually took effect or was approved by the board in February 2020. And a lot of the feedback that led to the amendments came from our LEAs, our school districts and charter schools, who had been engaged in the competency-based grant program. So our previous version of the rule required 990 hours of instructional services over 180 days. It also had minimum school day requirements like 2 hours in kindergarten or 4 hours in grades 1 through 12. And what happened is two of the big things. We changed the 990 hours of instructional hours to educational services with an emphasis on what the LEA provides and not so much on the number of hours of instruction that a student is engaged in. You can see here that instead of saying 990 instructional hours, we said an LEA shall provide 990 hours of educational services. Now, since this time, we've actually removed the requirement for the 990 hours for the 2021-22 school year, so the school year we're in now and next year. So currently, school districts and charter schools are required to provide 180 days of educational services. Next slide. The other thing I wanted to point out is that we changed terminology around what we used to call continuing enrollment measurement to allow LEAs to not only have an attendance validated way of demonstrating that a student is enrolled in their school district or charter school, but also a learner validated measurement for them to show that the student is engaged with their school district or charter school, and to measure their engagement instead of measuring that by whether the student is there in the classroom or not. And then last slide, I already mentioned that the State Board of Education eliminated the 990 hour requirement for the 2 upcoming school years, and changed the terminology around instructional hours to really focusing on what the LEA provides and not what the student is necessarily engaged in. And that was in order to show and provide the opportunity for students to be engaged as much as they need to. Some students may only need 2 to 3 hours a day. Other students may need more. So, and then last slide is just my contact information for your information, as well as some links to the resources that I mentioned today. And I'm happy to turn it back to you, John.
Thank you so much, Angie. It's always great to hear about the wonderful work that's going on in states across the country. If we go to the next slide, we are going to now hear from our second state presenter. Her name is Alyssa Muller. So Alyssa serves as the director of the Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative at the Washington State Board of Education. And in this role, she supports the state's mastery-based learning efforts to ensure each student is prepared for their next steps after high school. So Alyssa, welcome to the webinar. It's great to have you. Now, I think we heard a bit from Ben earlier, just very briefly, about some of Washington's Mastery-Based Learning Group activity, and I believe you're going to dig a bit more into the work that's been going on both historically and over the past year, correct?
That's exactly right, John. All right, well, I will take it away. So good afternoon, all. As John said, I'm Alyssa Muller, and I'm very pleased to be with you here today and to see some familiar faces in the audience. So with that, if we could go to the next slide. For over a decade, the definition of a high school credit has been delinked from seat time in Washington, and there's also been some provisions in state law that allow for mastery-based credit to be awarded to students based on their demonstration of proficiency of state learning standards. There's also been a waiver program for also over a decade for schools who wanted to engage at the building level more deeply in mastery-based learning practices. However, there hasn't really been an overall support structure for these schools to help them as they move toward mastery-based learning. So these policies paved the way for the state's mastery-based learning work group to really dig in deeper and think about how can we support schools from a structural level. Next slide. In 2019, legislation passed creating a state mastery-based learning work group, and we have been very lucky to have the chairs of both the House and the Senate Education Committees on the work group. We also have members representing the various levels of our education system, including state level organization representatives, as well as local school board members, superintendents, a principal, a teacher, a counselor, and 2 students. Next slide. Schools look very different today than they did when the work group began our journey back in early 2019 due to the coronavirus and the reckoning our country is undergoing as we grapple with our historical and present day structural racism. The work group truly believes that mastery-based learning is the way to transform our education system to close both the opportunity gap and the resulting achievement gap. The work group established the vision for mastery-based learning in our state and explored barriers to mastery-based learning. The work group also provided recommendations around how to expand capacity for mastery-based learning through policies and other supports. Next slide. One of the work group's recommendations was to develop a state and regional support structure to help schools who want to begin implementing mastery-based learning. We know that the transition to mastery-based learning requires a sustained effort over time to ensure that both state and local policies support implementation and schools and districts have access to resources to support their learning as they transform their systems. We have also heard from schools already implementing mastery-based learning how important it is to have a community of practice while making the transition to be able to brainstorm and problem solve together as implementation challenges arose. So we are very grateful to have legislative champions who were able to include some funding for the implementation of mastery-based learning and school district demonstration sites in Washington's 2021 to 2023 biennial budget. Our why for doing this work is specifically to advance equity in our education system. The project will engage a coalition of the willing whose work would not only respond to the current pandemic, but also jumpstart a longer-term shift to mastery-based learning to transform education into a more relevant and equitable learning experience for every student. The Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative will offer professional learning to in-service educators, including teachers, principals, and counselors, identify sample tools for educators using a mastery-based learning approach, and ensure that mastery-based learning is implemented through an explicit equity lens. School grant awardees will participate in the collaborative to share effective practices for implementing mastery-based learning. And the project's overarching goal is to inform future state policy by helping decision makers better understand what quality mastery-based learning looks like, how long it takes to implement, and what resources are necessary for schools to transition successfully. Next slide. Under the leadership of the Washington State Board of Education and with executive sponsorships from our partner agencies, the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction and the Professional Educator Standards Board, the project will involve a statewide effort, including staff at state agencies, regional educational service districts, community-based partners, education preparation programs, and of course, participating schools. We've also created the collaborative consulting group and an informal advisory group to really expand the breadth of expertise available to the collaborative and to act as a sounding board as we implement mastery-based learning across the state. Members represent the K-12 system, our higher education partners, industry, and community-based organizations. The collaborative also includes 3 other key groups, the participating schools. We've also hired Aurora Institute to be our independent evaluator, which we're very excited about. And then we are working to identify a professional learning provider who will be selected through a competitive request for proposals process that's ongoing. Next slide. So we have 18 schools who have applied and were selected to be part of our founding cohort, a few of which have been doing mastery-based learning already. We envision spring of 2022 as a planning period, and then the next 2 school years as professional learning years. Educators will begin implementing their professional learning during the 2022 to 23 school year while they learn, and then they will more completely implement mastery-based learning in their classrooms by the end of the 2023 to 24 school year. We know that full implementation of mastery-based learning may take 6 to 8 years or more. So our goal is simply for full building implementation to start by the end of 2023 to 24. Schools already implementing across their building when they began participating will have enhanced their implementation and shared knowledge and resources with our schools that are new to mastery-based learning. So that's just a really fast overview of the work that we have going on right now that we're really excited about. If we could just go to the next slide. Just wanted to include a slide that has some resources to some of the work that's going on. And then the final slide just has my contact information. So folks are welcome to reach out anytime. I will turn it back over to you, John.
Great, thank you so much, Alyssa, and thanks for sharing all the excellent work that you all are undertaking in Washington. We do have a couple of follow-up questions that we wanted to pose to each of our panelists before we transition over to our colleagues at the Aurora Institute. So Alyssa, since you presented last, we'll go ahead and start with you. So could you tell us a bit about how Washington plans to use the profile of a graduate specifically to expand student-centered learning?
Yeah, I'm happy to. First of all, I really want to acknowledge that we've learned from other states like Utah and some of the work that they've done that they've been a little bit ahead of us in. So Washington has been taking steps to increase our capacity to move towards more personalized learning systems across the state. And we're thinking about this work as a way of re-examining both what we're asking students to know how to do and how we ask them to demonstrate it. So we're really hoping that the profile of a graduate will be the bridge between sort of our more traditional schools and our mastery-based schools by conveying that every student is meeting the same learning standards. So the work group was charged actually during this legislative session to develop the profile of a graduate with a really fast turnaround. So we started the process in April and our report is due to the legislature on Friday, but who's counting? And so the legislature charged us to develop this profile describing the cross-disciplinary skills a student needs to develop by the time they graduate from high school to be successful in their next steps in life. So we're thinking about the profile as a way of really giving permission to our educators to focus on all of the important skills in the classroom we want our students to learn beyond just the academic content, like critical thinking and problem solving and how to work well in a team. So the work group really understands and has talked a lot about how it's going to take districts time to align their work to the vision and the state profile of a graduate. However, the state profile of a graduate will be our vision for the K-12 system moving forward to better support and develop every student as a whole person and prepare them to thrive in their life after high school. So we're really encouraging our school districts to begin a process to align their priorities to the profile of a graduate vision and goals. We don't believe that implementation of the profile should be just one more thing that schools are taking on in the midst of continuing to respond to the coronavirus pandemic, but rather we hope that the profile will serve as the North Star for a school district to help them design educational experiences that support every student in attaining the skills they're going to need in their journey after high school for success in post-secondary education, careers, citizenship, and lifelong learning. So each school district will be able to locally determine how to adapt their instruction to focus on developing these skills, as well as assess how students demonstrate they've gained foundational competency in each skill. And so while the work group is finalizing their recommendations, one of the things that they've talked about is recommending as a next step that a group of educators and community members be convened to develop sample rubrics and other tools for implementation. Similar to what the state of South Carolina has done for their profile of a graduate. We're hoping that by developing these sample tools, we could provide real life examples for how schools can really actualize the profile of a graduate in kindergarten and first grade, and so forth. So we believe providing these tools will be crucial to making the profile actionable for all schools and to our effort to use the profile to really reimagine our education system to be more focused on student-centered learning. So our report on the profile of a graduate and recommendations will be live on our website at the end of the week. So I'm happy to share it with folks when it's ready if anyone wants to reach out to me. And the last thing I would say about next steps for the profiles, in the same bill that charged the work group to develop the profile of a graduate, there's already a process laid out for some of the next steps. The legislature has already charged the State Board of Education with doing a holistic examination of state graduation requirements and submitting those recommendations to the legislature to align graduation requirements with the profile by December of next year. So that will be our big focus for next year.
Wow, you certainly have a lot going on in your state, and it's wonderful to hear about all that great work. So next, I'll turn back to Angie for a follow-up question. And in addition to the work that's being done in Utah around the definition of the credit hour, I also know that there is some excellent work that is starting to kick off around assessments and thinking about how to bring them in alignment with the state's vision for student-centered education. So I was wondering if you could maybe take a moment and just talk to us a bit about what is happening in that arena.
Yes, I'd love to. We're very excited about the work we're doing to redesign our accountability system. And I wanted to just give a shout out to Darren Nielsen, who is our Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning, who was here earlier. I don't know if he still is, but he's been leading a lot of this work. Our accountability system was last revised in 2017, which was prior to all of our advancement in our initiatives in personalized competency-based learning, as well as predates our portrait of a graduate. So there's a real need to update our accountability system. We also saw a lot of interest from our legislature. Different legislators also were expressing interest in seeing some updates to our accountability system. So what we've done is we've solicited support and help from consultants, including the Center of Assessment and KnowledgeWorks, to help us as we have set up an executive committee, which includes members of the State Board of Education, the House, the Senate, as well as the governor's office. That group is chaired by the chair of the State Board of Education and the majority whip of both the Senate and the House. They are the co-chairs of this executive committee. We are staffing it. The Utah State Board of Education staff act as staff for the group, and we are soliciting feedback from stakeholders across the state. There's also an advisory group of 31 members that include leaders in our school districts and charter schools, and our assessment directors, as well as parents and students also participate on that advisory group. And we have a lofty goal and a lofty timeline of providing some recommendations to the state board and the legislature in July of 2022. And we're very grateful for the partnership we have with our consultants to help support that work, to be able to do things such as looking at the feedback from stakeholders to inform the decisions or the recommendations that our executive committee will make to both the legislature and the State Board of Education. So yeah, very exciting work.
Great, incredibly exciting. And I can also drop a link in the chat here after we wrap up our discussion about some other innovative assessment practices that are going on around the country. So before we transition back to our friends at the Aurora Institute, we have one question we wanted to pose to both of you. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned about what's needed to advance this work at the state level? And then, really short, 30 seconds, kind of anything else you want to tell us about what's next for your state that you haven't told us about already. Alyssa, we can start with you.
Sure. Well, I would say one of the first things that I thought about when you said, start talking about lessons learned is how important it was for us to have the chair of both our House and our Senate education committees on our mastery-based learning work group, because they've been champions for mastery-based learning across our state, and they've sponsored legislation to advance mastery-based learning policies. And we've also heard from them how helpful it was to them to get to participate so that they could hear firsthand their perspectives and concerns from our current classroom educators and district leadership. So I felt really lucky to be able to staff that work group because we really had all of the right people around the table. I would also say that as far as lessons learned, we've been hearing that educators and schools can't take on one more thing right now. And yet, in the conversations that we've been having with educators and community members, a recurring theme that we keep hearing is that things aren't working and things need to change. So we've been thinking a lot about, how do we balance those? We know things aren't working and they need to change. And how do we do this in a way that doesn't just place additional demands on educators, that really supports them on taking on this work? As far as what's next, I mentioned that the state board's work next year is going to be focused on stakeholder engagement to develop those recommendations regarding how to align graduation requirements to the profile of a graduate. During the process to develop the profile, I was actually surprised by how much commonality we heard across stakeholder groups regarding the skills that should be emphasized in the profile. For instance, the skills that students would say that they wanted to spend time learning in school were the same skills that we heard from employers that they need. So it seems that in all of our conversations over the last couple of years that educators and families, students, higher education, employers, kind of all of the stakeholders in our system really see a need for change in the system and are excited by the vision for education and our profile of a graduate and for the possibilities around mastery-based learning. However, despite the desire for change, stakeholders have asked really thoughtful questions about implementation that have highlighted the need for authentic community engagement and an ongoing communications effort to describe the why behind the focus on student-centered learning, to really help families and communities understand why we're undertaking some of these changes. So part of the reason for Washington's Mastery-Based Learning Collaborative is to really support schools from a statewide level around how best to engage with their communities and help families understand how mastery-based learning can really help their kids to thrive. So this is a really important foundation for helping schools use mastery-based learning to move the needle on equity in our system. I have a lot of admiration for the work at the New York City Competency Collaborative, and I think Joy was here earlier. One of the things that I hear her say all the time that I've now started saying because of my learning from her is that mastery-based learning is not inherently culturally responsive and sustaining. It's up to us to make it that way. So we're really looking forward to helping schools thoughtfully implement mastery-based learning in an equitable way and finding ways to document that through our program evaluation. We're also trying to identify additional private funding to extend the grant period for schools, since we currently only have funding for 2.5 years, and we know that's not enough to help schools really implement mastery-based learning, in a thoughtful way for the long haul and in a sustainable manner. So we certainly don't have all of the answers, and we would welcome conversations with other folks on this journey anytime.
And I hope that that's a common theme that we hear often from all our states, that folks always want to work with each other on this. So Angie, we will let you have the last word. Tell us about what you've learned about this work so far in Utah and any other tidbits you want to share about what's coming up next for your state.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I would say, I want to echo what Alyssa said in that it's very powerful when you've got the legislature, the state board, and our LEAs all engaged and work together. Oftentimes, if one is trying to do something without the other two, it's just not going to be as powerful. We have been so grateful for legislative policymakers and investments that have supported the work that then this Utah State Board of Education can do to support our LEAs as they move along with student-centered learning or any kind of these big initiatives where we're trying to make system-wide changes. So I guess the moral of the story is when I used to work at the legislature, there were times when legislators or policymakers would try to would pass legislation that maybe, and they hadn't involved the State Board of Education or school districts and charter schools. And those bills or initiatives weren't necessarily as successful as when we do them together. And I'm happy to say that over the last 5 to 6 years that I've been at the State Board of Education, I've noticed a partnership, a true partnership where we do things together with the legislature, as well as our school districts and charter schools. And I think we have a great system in place and a great collaborative effort amongst our policymakers and stakeholders. A couple of things that and I wanted to add that I think that giving resources to state boards of education to allow for LEAs or districts and charters to come together, or resources for the state board to partner with outside consultants, that can really help move initiatives and provide supports, not only the state board, but to those school districts and charter schools who are really moving towards change. A couple of things I just wanted to mention that I forgot to leave out about when I talked about the accountability system revamp. Another key thing we're looking at doing is making sure our accountability system supports and is cohesive with our general school improvement efforts. We have a state school turnaround program, as well as we have our federal school improvement efforts. So we really want to look at aligning and making those cohesive amongst each other, as well as with our accountability system. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is our work on creating guidance for our school districts and charter schools on creating learner validated enrollment policies. What that means is it's a way of measuring student engagement other than just saying the student is here in the classroom. And I just wanted to give you quickly some examples of the learner validated enrollment guidance. It's a way for an LEA to say, instead of whether the student is there or not, what are some measurements that I can show that this student is engaged? So things like evidence that validates student learning, like submission of assignments or projects. The second one would be evidence that validates student participation. The student has logged in or has participated in, say, some sort of a discussion with either their teacher or with their fellow students. Evidence that validates student communication, again, that kind of communication between either students or the teacher. And then the last one is the duration or frequency minimums for student participation. Those have been really helpful as our LEAs have set those and trained their teachers on how to measure that a student is actually engaged and enrolled in their school versus just counting attendance. So that's it.
Great. Alyssa and Angie, thank you so much. That was such wonderful information, and we are so happy that we were able to engage you with this opportunity. And just as a quick reminder, I'm gonna pass things off to my colleague, Fred, here in a moment from the Aurora Institute. But if you do have questions, and we've had a number of them come in through the chat so far, we will have a brief Q&A at the end. So please keep dropping them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Fred Jones from the Aurora Institute. So Fred, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, John. And thank you, Alyssa and Angie, for a wonderful presentation and information. It's really informative and helps us guide us in our work. Each year, the Aurora Institute produces state and federal policy priorities that we hope will help give guidance to policymakers all across the country to advance student-centered learning. We've recently released our federal policy priorities, but we're also in the process of finalizing our state policy priorities with recommendations informed by people in the field. So those such as Alyssa and Angie and individuals from state departments of education across the country, but researchers, educators, students, community-based organizations as well. We solicit feedback each year to get a better understanding of the policy barriers and state policy barriers specifically that's prohibiting the advancement of student-centered learning. So we take this information and help drive our own, to help anchor and drive our own state policy priorities that we would love to share with the field in hopes that this can be something states can use to advance student-centered learning. So if we go to the next slide, please. I just want to review some of these. So I want to just run through a couple different recommendations given the time that we have. But first, some recommendations and considerations for state policymakers. The first thing that we would want states to consider is to reimagine education by developing a new definition of success using a profile of a graduate. We just heard from Alyssa and Angie how they're utilizing their respective profiles of a graduate or the development of a profile of a graduate to inform their state policy and redefine graduation requirements. But I would say just across the country, there's almost a quarter of states that have developed or are in the process of developing our profile of a graduate. These documents oftentimes set the vision for what high school graduates need to know and understand. And oftentimes they contain academic content knowledge, habits of success, personal characteristics that each graduate should know. It's a building blocks, I think, in terms of curriculum design, but also how states can go about both allocating and collecting resources for the future. So it's a very important component, and I think anchors the initial steps to advance student-centered learning. Secondly, states should consider transforming state funding formulas. and to interrupt historical inequities over time. I think we all understand the importance of school funding formulas. It's often the lifeblood of schools and what they are able to do, what they're able to fund, and the resources that they're able to provide. Unfortunately, there's a well-documented history of states providing inequitable per pupil expenditures. And so we think it's incredibly important that states take the opportunity to revise school funding formulas so that they're more equitable, but also work to um, work to essentially address inequities, resource inequity, but also achievement inequity. Um, and so we know many states are actually in a process of revising their own state funding formulas at this moment in time, but we would encourage states to consider ways in which this could be, states could be bolder in terms of amending funding formulas moving forward. Additionally, we would encourage states to increase access to and affordability of both traditional and non-traditional education preparation programs to recruit and retain a more diverse teacher workforce. There's research behind how building a more diverse educator workforce actually improves outcomes for all students. And we would encourage states to continue thinking about ways in which the teacher workforce or the educator workforce could diversify along with the student population changes that are happening across the country as well. Additionally, we encourage states to support new approaches to competency-based teaching and learning by investing in modernizing the educator workforce. Is specifically around creating more professional development opportunities and educator prep programs around how to implement CBE, and having direct ongoing training both at the preparation level, but also on an ongoing basis throughout the year. Next slide, please. Additionally, we encourage states to create student-centered, personalized competency-based education systems that empower students. This oftentimes has to do with just students advancing based off the mastery of learning and at sea time, and also having various options to learn both inside and outside of the school. We also encourage states to utilize innovation zones to advance mastery-based learning and to remove barriers to advance student-centered learning. Earlier, we heard from Ben actually that spoke about the innovation zones legislation that passed in New Hampshire and South Carolina. Innovation zones oftentimes they provide flexibility from current law and regulatory or regulations, but they also can be a mechanism in which states can test and scale up new practices, new learning models. And so we would encourage states to use that opportunity to advance CBE, but other evidence-based models that could be used to improve student outcomes. Additionally, states could reverse the inequities exacerbated by the impact of COVID-19. As we all know, COVID over the last couple of years has created many different problems for our students, our educators, and communities across the country. As states continue to receive federal funding along with other state funding, using those in a very strategic way to amplify their ability to help students adjust to the impacts of COVID-19. Additionally, states can invest in balanced assessment systems, including performance-based assessments. And so there's a couple opportunities, at least at the federal level, states can take advantage of. One has to do with the innovative assessment demonstration authority, as well as the state assessment grants as ways in which states can utilize funding and or programs to develop new innovative assessments, new competencies-based education assessments, new performance-based assessments, as a way to scale and innovate new forms of assessment within the state while also maintaining existing assessments that are mandated by current law. And then lastly, rethink accountability to engage communities in new designs that offer a broader range of approaches to evaluate school performance. This is essentially trying to work with communities across the country to come up with new approaches to evaluate school performance. So this is just a quick synopsis of some recommendations that we hope states would consider. If states are interested in diving deeper on how this actually could apply in your individual states, we're more than happy to work with you, and more than happy to reach out to us offline to talk about this in more detail. But with that, I know we're coming up to close to the hour. I'll turn this back over to John just to see if there's any questions that we may be able to answer before the top of the hour.
Great, thanks, Fred. And I know we have about 3 minutes, so just if I can make a quick ask, both Alyssa and Angie of you, I know that you both shared your email addresses on the screen, and we had a number of great questions come in. Would you both mind just sharing those really quick to everyone in the chat? So if we don't get a chance to answer everyone's questions, folks could just send anything directly to you that they may have. That would be wonderful. So let's do a quick rapid fire. Any responses you may have to a few of the questions that were posed, maybe say about 20, 30 seconds, which I know is going to be tough, but we'll see what we can do. So the first kind of question, we actually got this twice, is how have you involved students in your work to date?
I can just reiterate briefly what I said in chat. We had students on our work group, which I can't recommend enough. We also found really intentional ways of engaging with students through a series of focus groups, which was really helpful.
In Utah, we have a student advisory council, and there's 15 members at advisory council. They're juniors and seniors, and they serve 2-year terms, and they meet, I believe it's every other month or once a month. And they take a look at the agenda of the state board, and they provide recommendations on different policies. And it's been really powerful to hear from them. And I was just talking to Darren, we're going to solicit information from them as well on our accountability redesign and make sure we get them included in providing feedback.
Great, thank you both. Another question we had is someone was interested in learning a bit more about how the shift towards hybrid and remote approaches have played a role in the work that you've been taking on over the last year or so, if at all.
I didn't hear what you said there, John. How the role of what in
remote and hybrid learning options.
Oh, yes. Interestingly, I was just speaking to a group of superintendents earlier this week because last week our board changed our board rule again, or approved an extension of removing the 990 hours. And part of the conversation was about how students are supported in person versus a remote or in a hybrid. And part of our assessment results that were very interesting were that the highest percentage of performances last year came from our group that were engaged in hybrid. So they did primarily, it was majority in person, but they also did a portion of remote learning. That group of students seemed to perform the best in our assessments last year. I will say that that was a common schedule. We were in person the full year, the majority, I think with the exception of one school district, we were in person for the entire year. But many of our districts and charters had a 5th day where they had many students engage in remote learning, and then they brought some of their students in for interventions, but it also allowed teachers to really prepare their online and remote offerings for students. So that hybrid learning seemed to be very effective and allowed students on that 5th day to engage in work they needed to, whether it was to catch up with homework or review, and was very powerful.
Melissa, anything to add on that question before we close?
I'll just say, for the sake of time, we've had some similar experiences in Washington.
Great, well, thank you so much. Well, I will pass it back over to my colleague, Fred Jones. And Fred, you get to have the last word with us today.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, Alyssa, Ben, Angie, Natalie, or John, excuse me, for attending and presenting today. We really appreciate it. For everyone who's still with us, please take a moment to fill out our Survey Monkey survey just about today's webinar. This helps us in terms of developing content and modifying these sessions moving forward. So your feedback is immensely helpful, and it will take just 60 seconds. But with that, again, I just want to say thank you to everyone. And if you have any questions or follow-up, feel free to also reach out to me at fjones@aurorainstitute.org, or you can contact our page or any one of the panelists as well to follow up. we wanted to, again, thank you, everyone, and appreciate your time today. And thank you to our panelists once again.